At the time of the founding of the British colonies in North America, slavery was an established practice in a variety of locations. While the institution would evolve over the centuries in practice in North America, at the time of the first landing of the British on the continent, slavery was not an alien form of labor. English settlers came to the mainland of North America to prosper, and the way to do so was tied to trade. Each colony was to find something to produce for the home market back in England, and then, with a favorable balance of trade, purchase products made in England. When examining the development of slavery in the mainland colonies, it's important to remember that African slavery in North America began for different reasons, and through the 17th and 18th centuries, various forms of slave systems developed in each mainland area. One developed in the Chesapeake region with smaller plantations. One in the Carolina and Georgia Low Country with larger plantations, and one in the northern colonies without plantations at all. The separate regions had different economies and particular labor needs, so over the years they developed different demographic characteristics, especially in the proportion of blacks to whites, and the proportion of native-born Africans to persons of African descent born in the colonies. The interplay of factors determined the nature of the slave system and the African American society that evolved in each of these regions. The first settlers in colonial Virginia after 1607 and Maryland after 1634 found a relatively mild climate and land that was abundant, fertile, and relatively thinly populated by the Native American population. These conditions were pretty perfect for what the merchants and speculators who paid for this colony wanted: rapid profits. They hoped settlers could quickly begin producing a crop, a staple crop, that is, a crop that would establish the economic foundation of this colony, a crop not grown in England, sell it on the English market, and buy English manufactured goods in return. This early English enterprise would prompt more English to come to the colonies and grow more of this crop. Taxes on this trade would help the king, and the fields of American mainland would be places to send the growing number of unemployed Englishmen, of Englishmen who didn't own land, who were seen as posing a threat to society, that suffered from declining wages, from civil war, and from social turmoil. Well, if Virginia and Maryland didn't exactly fit this model, the two colonies came pretty close. Within a decade of settlement, the Virginia colonists were growing tobacco, which the English used more than any other European group, and getting really good prices for this export while importing a variety of English-made goods. Despite the presence of Native Americans, the English began to lay claim to a great deal of land, and opportunities seemed limitless. Of course, there is an entire history of the relationship between the English and Native Americans, which include long battles, betrayals, disease. But the focus of this lecture is going to be on the development of slavery in these different regions. As tobacco boomed, there grew a demand for labor, probably beyond the expectations of the early colonial settlers. Still, England had plenty of poor men wanting work, and was primarily these young men, um, average age around 16, who came to the colonies in the early decades to work the tobacco fields. Unable to afford their passage to the colony, these laborers made arrangements with recruiters in England to repay their fare through work in the new lands. They came mostly as servants, some as tenants working for shares of the crop, but mostly as servants, and all had fairly long terms of servitude, anywhere from 5 to 7 years. Early colonial planters were not solely tied to English indentured servants, however. For a time, there was a hope that Native Americans would work in the fields and benefit from what the English saw as their civilizing tendencies, and over time develop a harmonious relationship with the colonists. This vision never materialized for a variety of reasons, but largely it seems because Native Americans, um, their culture, their lifestyle, conflicted greatly with that of a kind of regimented cultivator. They resisted, they rebelled against the work, and escaped or died under the strain and exposure to disease. English mainland colonists imported people of African descent as well, the first in Jamestown in 1619, and they seem to fit this kind of colonial labor ideal better. Although what their precise status during these early years wasn't exactly clear, these early African arrivals were servants in somewhat the same sense as their white counterparts, um, although most were probably closer to slaves than they were servants. On the whole, these Africans seem to serve longer periods of service than whites. But some Africans in Virginia gained their freedom. Some owned servants themselves. Early Chesapeake planters preferred white servants over Africans. During the last 2 decades of the 17th century, however, fewer white laborers came to the Chesapeake region. Some were attracted to opportunities in New York, taken over from the Dutch by the English in 1664, and Pennsylvania, established in 1681. Others found more opportunities in England. Soon, the number of white servants entering Virginia and Maryland dwindled rapidly. Through the 1690s, more whites left the Chesapeake colonies than entered, and white servant immigration was almost completely non-existent by 1700. Still, planters seemed to prefer white labor and sought young English women and Irish men. It appears that most planters switched to African slaves out of a sense of what they saw as a necessity, but a necessity that they didn't hesitate to seize. Large numbers of English shippers began to participate in the trade of slaves from Africa in the last third of the 17th century. African slaves were relatively inexpensive and were, unlike white servants, in abundant supply. Now, shifting to the Carolina and Georgia Low Country, we see a very different history of slavery. Initial settlement of the coastal lowland area that stretched from Cape Fear in the north to the St. Mary's River in the south is the area that makes up the Atlantic border of South Carolina and Georgia. Slavery develops here in different ways from the settlement in the Chesapeake. Early migrants to this area came from other English colonies, Barbados in particular in the Caribbean. In a sense, South Carolina is a result of the consolidation of sugar production in the Caribbean, particularly, again, in Barbados. As fewer and fewer planters in Barbados controlled a greater and greater proportion of the land, smaller sugar planters were pushed out, and many wound up immigrating to South Carolina. Like their neighbors, they came intent on producing for an English market, but not tobacco. The first migrants to South Carolina came after 1670 with a very clear sense of who would do the work of production. African slavery had been used extensively in the sugarcane fields of Barbados since the 1640s. The administrators of the territory granted generous amounts of land to settlers for bringing African slaves to the colony. During the first year of the colony, 20 acres of land were given for every African man who was brought over, and 10 acres of land were given for every African woman. So there was an incentive to arrive with slaves. So black slaves were present in South Carolina at its founding, and after a generation of settlement, persons of African descent constituted a majority of the low country population. The extension of settlement and agricultural production along the Atlantic low country then would mean the spread of an economy and society based on slavery. Another difference between the low country and the Chesapeake had to do with the environment. The lowland country was subtropical, a land of summer heat and humidity, swamps and forests. It is more like the islands of the British Caribbean or the homelands of many Africans than any part of England or the northern mainland colonies. For the first 30 years of settlement, they concentrated on providing livestock and timber for the English in the Caribbean, and deerskins for England. After that, they turned gradually, but then almost totally, to the production of rice. Before 1700, fair numbers of African men and women came from societies that cultivated rice. These West Africans played a central role in South Carolina, the colony's move to a rice economy. The beginning of rice production brought about a demand for labor that would cause South Carolina to import more slaves than any other mainland colony through the rest of the 18th century. The transformation to rice production in South Carolina and its spread to Georgia brought about plantation agriculture on a scale not yet seen in North America. And of course, this large-scale plantation required operations that affected the working lives of slaves. In many ways, it is impossible to completely separate out the experiences of African slaves from the stories of how slavery was established and grew increasingly rigid over time. For example, the experience of the first two generations of Africans in South Carolina is quite different than the experience of the next generations. There is no question that even at the founding of the colonies, Africans were treated differently, and that usually meant worse. It's also true that rigid lines, cultural, economic, political, and social, had not yet been drawn during the early period of colonial development. White servitude and black slavery were both different and the same. White servants and African slaves did similar work. Initially, they were punished in similar ways. Over time, however, as English colonists increasingly relied not only on the labor, but the particular skills that Africans possessed, and as Africans became a cheaper and more productive form of labor, the colonists impose greater and greater control over Africans. The initial harsh conditions of the colonies put the Africans and the English colonists on a more or less equal footing. As the colonies become more and more established, a more rigid order, a more oppressive form of slavery is imposed.